October 22nd, 1944, South China Sea. The storm had passed, but the sky still growled. Low clouds brushed the waves like smoke over wet glass. Beneath them, a 6-ship convoy crawled across the water. 4 oil tankers, 2 destroyer escorts, rust-streaked, half-loaded, weeks behind schedule. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka stood on the starboard catwalk of Toho Maru, the lead tanker, coat clutched tight, jaw stiff in the salt wind. 32 years old, Naval Academy class of 37. Never fired a weapon, but every drum of fuel beneath his feet was more powerful than any bullet. He looked down at the map in his hands, creased, stained with sweat and engine oil. The plotted course hugged the Philippines too closely. American submarines had been spotted near Luzon 2 days prior. Command said, "Hold steady. Stay on path." Tanaka didn't. He turned the helm 7 degrees east, shaving 40 nautical miles off the route, into deeper, colder waters, a place no Japanese convoy had risked in weeks, not for heroism, not for glory, just to save diesel. "The Americans don't know we're here," he muttered. He was wrong, but not in the way he thought. The enemy wouldn't find him. They'd find what he carried. And that mistake, quiet, invisible, illegal, would become the only reason an entire fleet could keep fighting. One last time. In Tokyo, they called it Operation Shogo 1, the decisive plan to repel the American invasion of the Philippines. A 3-pronged counterattack: Northern Decoy Force, Center Force, Southern Support Group. But none of it worked without oil. Every shell, every torpedo, every propeller blade on every Zero fighter depended on the crude that now sloshed inside Lieutenant Tanaka's tanker. By late 1944, the Japanese Imperial Navy was bleeding fuel faster than it could be replaced. The Borneo fields were too far. The convoys were too slow. American submarines hunted them like wolves, and each loss rippled across the entire command. Destroyers without range, aircraft grounded, capital ships idle in port. Admiral Kurita's Center Force, Task Force A, was the heart of the Shogo plan. Battleships Yamato and Musashi, heavy cruisers Chikuma, Tone, and Suzuya, destroyers bristling with depth charges. But they were ghosts without fuel, empty hulls, titanic machines strangled by logistics. And somewhere hundreds of miles south, Lieutenant Tanaka sailed with 11,000 tons of Type 2 aviation gasoline and high-octane diesel meant for the southern wing of the fleet. His manifest listed San Jose as the delivery point. But after his deviation, the convoy veered east toward the Leyte Gulf. The decision wasn't based on strategy. It was instinct. He had studied the currents, felt the wind. The forecast spoke of cyclonic pressure systems forming west of Palawan. If they stayed the current course, they'd be caught in headwinds, losing time, losing fuel, and risking detection. His navigational charts, forbidden from being updated without approval, still bore the ink of 1937. But Tanaka wasn't blind. He saw the lines that didn't make sense, islands that had shifted in the memory of war, lighthouses that no longer blinked. American pilots had bombed navigation beacons for months. No signal was reliable. His shortcut was a gamble, not for glory, for survival. 5 decks below, under rusted hatch doors and creaking valves, the tanks groaned with pressure. A single leak would turn the Toho Maru into a floating bomb. In the galley, engineers played cards with stained fingers, joking about home, about how rice was cheaper than sake now, and about wives they hadn't seen in 3 years. They didn't know the fleet was starving. They didn't know the battleship Musashi was preparing to fire her 18-inch guns at American carriers off Samar, but only had enough fuel for a single sortie. And no one, not Tanaka, not his escort commanders, not the men manning the valves and winches, knew that this convoy, routed illegally, was the only one within range that could deliver oil where it was truly needed, directly into Kurita's engines. In his cabin, Tanaka studied the map again. He ran a finger over Leyte Gulf. Something about the silence of the radio bothered him. He had requested confirmation of the new route. No reply. He sent again. Nothing. But still, he didn't turn back. 3 days earlier, a tanker 2 convoys ahead, Nishin Maru No. 2, was torpedoed off Cape Engano. No survivors. 6,000 kiloliters of fuel gone in 60 seconds. Tanaka had read the coded report in silence. His fingers tightened around the compass wheel. 7 degrees. That's all he had done. Just 7. His executive officer warned him, "Command will court-martial you if they find out." Tanaka nodded. "If we're still alive by then, I'll take it." That night, beneath stars hidden by cloud, the Toho Maru moved like a ghost through the waves. She passed through empty sea lanes, flanked by coral shoals and volcanic silhouettes. A week later, near the coast of Leyte, her silhouette was spotted, not by Americans, but by a lone scout boat from the Kumano, a cruiser in desperate need of fuel. The message that reached Admiral Kurita's staff was simple. Unexpected convoy, full load, request immediate offload permission. Kurita's reply came faster than any command had in days. Divert, offload, save the fleet. By the time the Americans arrived, it was too late. The morning they reached Leyte Gulf, the water was glass, still and watching. Low fog clung to the sea like breath on a mirror. Visibility was no more than 2 cables. The tanker convoy moved forward in silence, its diesel engines thumping like war drums under wool blankets. Even the seagulls were gone. Lieutenant Tanaka stood on the bridge, eyes fixed on the shifting wall of mist. The eastern sky glowed with hints of daylight, but it never fully broke. Shadows moved inside the fog, shapes like ships, illusions born of tension and diesel fumes. The radio crackled, static, then a voice. "Kumano cruiser confirms position, requesting coordinates for fuel transfer." Tanaka exhaled for the first time in hours. But something felt wrong. It was too quiet. No enemy aircraft, no periscopes, no distant gunfire, just the rhythmic churn of water under hull. Then a lookout shouted, "Port side, smoke plume, bearing 095. Tanaka grabbed his binoculars. The shape was faint, black against gray, moving fast. Not American, not Japanese either. It vanished. They called it a ghost ship. Just a flash. No confirmation. No torpedo wake followed. No alarm sounded. Still, Tanaka's pulse climbed. Below deck, sailors whispered that the sea was cursed, that ghosts of Midway and Guadalcanal haunted these waters. Some prayed beneath their hammocks. Others just cleaned their rifles. Tanaka didn't believe in spirits, but he believed in patterns. And something was off. Why hadn't the Americans intercepted them? Where were the Hellcats? The submarines? He went back to the map. A detail flickered in his memory. A current that ran faster along the southern trench. It could have carried them here ahead of schedule, by nearly 12 hours. Which meant they weren't early. They were alone. Exposed. If American reconnaissance spotted them now, it wouldn't be a skirmish. It would be a massacre. He gave the order. No lights, no signal flags, Maintain speed. Load all AA batteries. The crew obeyed without question. Even the executive officer, once critical of the shortcut, said nothing. They steamed forward, 6 ships of fragile metal carrying the last hope of the center force, through a wall of mist, hoping no one was watching. They didn't know that someone was. But he wasn't flying for Japan. He wore blue, and he'd already marked their position. Aboard the USS Darter, submerged 90 feet beneath the Luzon Strait, Lieutenant Commander David McClintock stared at the sonar screen. His operator looked up. Multiple contacts. Slow. Spread formation. Could be tankers. McClintock adjusted his glasses. Heading? Southwest, toward Leyte. The captain's brow tightened. That was off pattern. The Japanese supply lines weren't supposed to come through this trench, not anymore. He ordered the periscope raised. The lens broke the surface for seconds, just long enough to catch a ghost-like silhouette in the fog. No escort flag, merchant hulls, fuel ships. McClintock's hand hovered near the fire switch. But then he paused. There were no destroyers, no zigzag maneuvers. This wasn't a decoy. This was desperation. He lowered the scope and held fire. He didn't know why. Not yet. But something told him. These weren't targets. They were symptoms. At that same hour, 35 miles away, Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of Yamato, scanning the horizon with binoculars that weighed more than most rifles. His fleet had just emerged from the San Bernardino Strait, miraculously undetected. But they were low on everything: fuel, morale, time. His staff officer approached, holding a flimsy message, freshly decoded. Unscheduled convoy, full load, arriving from South China Sea. Kurita blinked. No such convoy had been authorized. No such fuel had been logged. But if it was true, he looked up. Where? South flank, near Tacloban. He closed his eyes and made the call. All ships reduce speed. Redirect Hamakaze and Isuzu for immediate rendezvous. Begin refueling operations. A chorus of stunned looks passed between officers. Kurita didn't care. His fleet wasn't fighting paper. It was fighting fuel. Back aboard Toho Maru, the skies finally broke. The fog thinned, and on the horizon, a silhouette, a cruiser, real, Japanese, flying the rising sun, the Kumano. Tanaka let out a single, bitter breath. He had made it. The shortcut had worked. The convoy's tanks hissed open. Black hoses uncoiled like serpents across the ocean, connecting ship to ship in a ballet of pressure and timing. Diesel flowed, and so did history. That night, Kurita's battleships would fire their main guns in anger for the last time. Not because of a plan, not because of a strategy, but because one junior officer, 7 degrees off course, disobeyed a map and delivered hope with 11,000 tons of flammable defiance. The refueling took 6 hours. By twilight, every hose was drained. Every tank groaned with new weight. Aboard the Yamato, engineers wept, not from sentiment, but from relief. The boilers roared awake. Pressure gauges surged. Steel pistons moaned as turbines spun to life. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were a fleet again. Kurita gave the order. All ships, prepare for night maneuver. In silence, the battleships peeled off, north by east, toward the sound of American carrier air wings. On the deck of Toho Maru, Tanaka leaned against the railing, staring at the black water below. He should have felt proud. Instead, something twisted inside him. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. That convoy, his convoy, was never meant for Yamato. The oil was destined for a reserve group off Cebu, a depot fleet, rear logistics, not the tip of the spear. Tanaka realized, in that moment, he had broken the chain, and that break had rewired the war. In a war room outside San Francisco, analysts scratched their heads. A Japanese refueling? Inside the combat zone? Impossible. Their maps showed the Yamato too far gone, her range too limited, her fuel sources gone. And yet, she moved. Their models collapsed. Over 20 American destroyers were repositioned that night. Carrier decks were cleared for rapid sortie. They didn't know why the Japanese were still in the fight. Only that somehow they were. Somewhere between broken code, bad weather, and bureaucratic delay. One tanker had slipped through, and that leak would stain the Pacific with fire by dawn. October 25th, 1944. The Battle off Samar. At a 6:58, the American escort carrier Gambier Bay launched a flight of FM-2 Wildcats, a routine patrol. Pilots joked on the radio about breakfast rations and cloudy skies. Then radar lit up. Fast, close, unbelievable. Battleships, Japanese, at full steam. Contacts bearing 210. Closing fast. Looks like Yamato. The voice on the headset cracked. That's not possible, someone whispered. But it was. The Yamato had fuel, she had range, and she was hunting. The American Taffy 3 unit, escort carriers, destroyer escorts, nothing more, was caught flat-footed. No one expected capital ships. Certainly not here. Certainly not now. But Kurita's guns opened fire. Shells the size of telephone poles screamed through the sky. Water geysers rose like buildings. Radio chatter turned into panic. One destroyer captain radioed command. We're engaging enemy battleships with torpedoes. This is suicide, but we'll do it. They fought like hell. Pilots dived with empty bomb racks just to distract the gunners. Destroyers charged headfirst into cruisers, firing smoke, firing everything. They shouldn't have been able to stand, but they did. And the world watched in disbelief. Aboard Toho Maru, anchored behind a cove south of Leyte, Tanaka listened through a shortwave set, coded transmissions bleeding through static. Enemy sighted, heavy bombardment. They're firing. He recognized the fleet names. Kumano, Suzuya, Yamato, all fueled by his error. He sat in silence. The crew below boiled tea as if nothing was happening. No medals would come, no name in the record. He had fed the machine, and now it was burning. By 09:30 the tide began to turn. American planes, late but lethal, found the Japanese ships. One by one, carriers, battleships, cruisers took hits. Musashi had already sunk the day before. Chikuma would go next, Suzuya after that, and Yamato, the monster, would retreat. She had been fueled for glory. But glory, it turned out, was a myth. She turned her stern to the east and ran. Even oil can't outrun destiny. By midnight, the sea was quiet again, except for the fires, burning orange on the horizon, flickering over oil-slicked waves. Tanaka didn't sleep. In his logbook, he drew a straight line. From Formosa to the shortcut. 7 degrees. 7 degrees that changed nothing and everything. He had broken regulation. He had rerouted fuel. He had saved a fleet so it could fail one more time. Yamato never reached the invasion beaches. She never struck the carriers she was built to kill. Her guns roared over empty water, sinking a jeep carrier and scattering destroyers, yes, but the decisive blow Japan needed? It never came. Because even fueled, the fleet was already broken. 3 days later, Toho Maru was recalled. Not honored, not thanked, inspected. 2 officers boarded, scribes from Naval Command. They reviewed logs, cross-checked the manifest, demanded navigation charts. Tanaka stood at attention, while they circled his decisions like vultures. "You deviated." "Yes, sir." "On whose authority?" "My own." "You knowingly bypassed headquarters?" "I followed the wind." They didn't understand. They weren't there. They didn't smell the engines choking, didn't see the black oil in the bilge, didn't feel the current pulling eastward like a warning. They only saw ink on paper. He was ordered to Tokyo, pending review. He packed in silence. Before disembarking, he walked the length of the tanker, touched the railing, listened to the soft hiss of residual fuel venting through pressure valves. This ship, this ghost, had carried salvation into a dead cause, not to win the war, just to delay the inevitable. The men below sang while they cleaned the deck, an old Navy folk song from Hiroshima, cheerful in a way that didn't belong anymore. Tanaka didn't stop them. Let them sing. Let them believe. But he knew. The fleet hadn't been saved. It had been prolonged. And his shortcut, his rebellion, had only fed the delusion. One more drop. 5 months later. Tanaka stood behind a chain-link fence at a makeshift internment yard outside Manila. His officer's uniform was gone, replaced by threadbare work clothes. A number stitched to the chest. The war was over. But the humiliation was just beginning. Across the yard, an American transport convoy idled under the midday sun. Olive-drab trucks stacked high with drums, crates, and steel barrels. An army of logistics in motion. Tanaka watched with tired eyes. But then, something strange. Among the fuel and spare parts, he saw a refrigerated container being unloaded with care, guards laughing, sailors slapping its side like it carried treasure. He squinted. Inside were tins, marked with block letters. Ice cream, vanilla. He blinked. It wasn't a hallucination. Ice cream, in a war zone, delivered before dawn. A fellow prisoner muttered, "They bring dessert before supplies." Tanaka didn't answer. He couldn't, because in that moment, something broke, quietly, finally. Not from shame, not from defeat, but from contrast. He thought back to the rusted pressure gauges aboard Toho Maru, the crew patching leaks with canvas and twine. The fear of one more leak, one more patrol, one more silent death. And here, American soldiers unloading dessert. Smooth, cold, sweet, as if war hadn't touched them. As if logistics was a language they'd mastered while Japan still whispered in steam and oil. Later that day, a young American guard passed by the fence, barely 20. Tanaka nodded politely. The boy stopped, reached into his mess tin, and wordlessly handed over a spoon. Cold, sweet, vanilla. Tanaka held it in his mouth like it was a relic. And in that melting silence, he finally understood. The war hadn't been lost in the straits, or skies, or blood-streaked beaches. It had been lost in the supply line, in the margin between desperation and abundance, between a shortcut that saved fuel and a system so strong it delivered ice cream to the front. Tokyo Bay, September 1945. The war was finished. The documents signed, the flags lowered. But the reckoning had only begun. Inside a dim room once used by the Imperial Navy's Logistics Bureau, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka stood before a tribunal of 3 men, 2 admirals and 1 bureaucrat, all hollow-eyed, all clinging to procedure like it still meant something. A fan spun slowly overhead, slicing warm air that smelled of mold and ink. One admiral cleared his throat. "You deviated from authorized routes during a time of heightened combat activity. Your logs confirm this." Tanaka stood straight. "Yes, sir." "You made no attempt to secure rerouting approval." No, sir. You acknowledge this was a violation of Article 44. Yes, sir. The third man, older, sharper, leaned forward. And yet, your deviation resulted in fuel reaching Task Force A. Tanaka didn't move. The man continued. You understand that without that fuel, the Yamato and others may not have engaged. I understand. Do you consider that a success? Tanaka looked past them, at the window, at the rusting cranes in the bay. At the time, I considered it necessary. Silence. They didn't sentence him. There was no point. There were no fleets left to demote him from, no uniforms to strip, no empire to serve. They gave him a dismissal letter, unsigned, and told him to report to the Public Recovery Office for reassignment. Sanitation, census, rebuilding, something meaningless. But what stayed with him wasn't the lack of punishment. It was the lack of acknowledgement. No medal, no reprimand, just erasure. As if his mistake, his miracle, had been too inconvenient to remember. That night, he walked along the ruined pier. Fishermen sat quietly, casting lines into a bay that once birthed battleships. A girl laughed somewhere in the distance. A dog barked. Life, absurdly, was returning. Tanaka closed his eyes. He could still smell the oil, still hear the valves, still feel the weight of that shortcut. 7 degrees off course. He had saved a fleet that no longer existed, fired a shot he never intended, and in doing so, erased himself. Months later, a single-room apartment on the edge of Yokosuka, once a barracks, now a forgotten cell with paper walls and a broken faucet. Tanaka lived there. No visitors, no letters, just ration bread, cold tea, and silence. Every morning he woke at 05, still by habit, and reached for a logbook that no longer existed. His fingers hovered in the air before falling limp. Then he boiled water, cleaned the same teacup, and sat in the corner, listening to the wind through cracked glass. The war was over, but it hadn't left. It lived in his lungs, in the smell of diesel he couldn't wash out, in the creak of floorboards that reminded him of tankers under pressure, in the nightmares where steel groaned before torpedoes struck. He had not been imprisoned, but he had not been freed. Sometimes, late at night, he'd walk the dockyards, past rusted cranes, past sunken keels, past American sentries who didn't stop him, didn't care. And in the silence, he saw ghosts, not of men, but of machines, fuel drums, valve keys, engine schematics memorized by heart, the forgotten gods of war. They had built an empire on supply lines, on oil, on schedules. And when that machine failed, men like him were discarded, not for treason, but for making it work. One last time. One evening, he found an American bulletin posted near the harbor. It showed a photograph of a U.S. naval convoy arriving in Tokyo Bay. Clean ships, smiling crews, fresh uniforms. One caption read, "Rebuilding begins. Ice cream delivered first." Tanaka stared at it and laughed. A dry, broken sound that echoed off steel and water. Ice cream first, fuel second. That was the difference. Japan had burned its future on belief. America had chilled its war in vanilla. He tore down the bulletin, folded it, carried it home, not as a trophy, but as a lesson, and placed it beside a torn map of the South China Sea, still marked with a red line 7 degrees east. In 1953, long after uniforms were folded and flags replaced, a U.S. naval attaché visited a reconstruction office in Yokohama. He was tracking fuel records, specifically how one Japanese convoy reached the Yamato on October 24, 1944. The manifest was never archived. The captain's name never recorded in battle summaries, but a junior clerk remembered a signature. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, tanker Toho Maru. The American officer scribbled a note in his journal. Unauthorized shortcut may have enabled battle off Samar. Targets survived, only to retreat. And then, in the margin, a second line. Lost war, but navigated perfectly. Tanaka never read those words. He never saw the classified memos or debriefs. Never knew that American officers had pieced together his deviation, had even run simulations to confirm the timing, the range, the trajectory of fuel. But in a small wooden box, tucked behind his sleeping mat, he kept two things: the folded U.S. bulletin with the ice cream photo, and his original navigation chart, creased, stained, marked in pencil, Pulse 7 to grain E. He never redrew it, because sometimes maps don't need correcting. They need remembering. He died in 1967. No family, no grave marker, just a notation in city records. Former naval officer, occupation, clerk. But in Annapolis, during a 1985 lecture on Pacific naval logistics, a professor referenced a ghost convoy, a shortcut, an illegal move, a moment when the Axis supply machine sputtered, and one man, anonymous, unnoticed, delivered oil to a fleet already dying. The class laughed. "It bought them a day," one student joked. "What's that matter?" The professor replied softly, "Sometimes a single day is the only thing left worth buying." We remember battles. We remember victories. But war isn't just fire and fury. It's fuel. And in the silent math of logistics, 7 degrees can redraw history. One shortcut, one mistake, one man, alone on a rusted tanker, made a decision not to save a fleet, but to shave a mile. And in doing so, he carried the Empire's last breath. Not with pride, not with orders, just with a hand on the helm, and a map no one believed in anymore. Would you have done it? If the choice was between obedience or a course only you could see. Would you turn 7 degrees? Would you trust the current? Would you take the risk just to deliver one last drum of hope? Because sometimes that's all it takes. A shortcut, a silence, a sailor, and the war turns.